The warning alarms screamed through the cockpit of the Wanderer as Captain Jake Harrison pushed his ship harder through the debris field near the Crimson Nebula, where most pilots refused to go because the radiation could fry navigation systems. In seconds, Jake had been tracking an elven supply convoy for 3 days, hoping to disrupt their operations and maybe steal some of their advanced weapons, but what he found instead would change everything. He thought he knew about this war. A small escape pod tumbled through space, leaking oxygen and trailing sparks from damaged systems, and Jake's scanners showed a single life form inside, along with 2 smaller signatures that did not match any species in his database. He should have ignored it because the pod clearly came from an elven ship, and every fiber of his being screamed that elves were the enemy who had destroyed his home colony 5 years ago, killing everyone he loved, including his younger sister Amy, who was only 12 years old. But Jake had rules he lived by, and one of them was that he never left anyone to die alone in the cold darkness of space, no matter who they were or what uniform they wore. The Wanderer's cargo bay doors opened, and Jake maneuvered the damaged pod inside using the tractor beam, his hands steady on the controls despite the anger and confusion swirling in his chest. When the bay pressurized, Jake grabbed his plasma pistol and approached the pod carefully, because he knew elven warriors were trained from childhood to kill humans without hesitation or mercy. The pod's door hissed open, and Jake saw her for the first time, and his breath caught in his throat, because she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, even unconscious and injured. Her silver hair floated around her face like liquid moonlight, and her skin had a slight luminescent quality that all elves possessed, and her pointed ears were adorned with intricate jewelry that marked her as nobility. But what shocked Jake most were the 2 small dragons curled protectively on her chest, their scales shimmering with colors that changed between emerald green and sapphire blue as they breathed. The red dragon, which was no bigger than a house cat, lifted its head and stared at Jake with intelligent amber eyes and released a small puff of smoke from its nostrils as a warning. Jake holstered his weapon and raised his hands slowly because he knew dragons were sacred to the elven people, and harming one would bring down the wrath of the entire empire. The blue dragon chirped softly and tilted its head as if studying the human captain with curiosity rather than fear. Jake carefully lifted the unconscious woman from the pod and carried her to the medical bay, while the 2 dragons flew alongside him, their wings barely making a sound. He placed her on the medical table, and the ship's automated systems began scanning her injuries, which included a concussion, 3 cracked ribs, and severe dehydration. The dragons landed on either side of their mistress and watched Jake's every move as he started an IV drip and applied healing gel to the bruises covering her arms. Jake noticed the royal insignia tattooed on her left wrist, and his stomach dropped, because he realized he had just rescued an elven princess. And if her people found out, they would assume he kidnapped her. He checked her identification chip, and the name made his blood run cold because Princess Lyra was the daughter of Emperor Theron, who had personally ordered the attack on Jake's colony. Jake could kill her right now and no one would ever know. And it would be justice for Amy and all the other innocent people who died screaming as elven warships bombarded their homes. His hand moved toward his pistol, and the red dragon immediately flew at his face, breathing a small jet of flame that singed his eyebrows. The blue dragon positioned itself over Lyra's throat, and its scales began to glow with a cold light that Jake knew meant it was preparing to release a freezing breath. Jake stepped back and laughed bitterly, because even unconscious, the princess was protected by creatures that could kill him in seconds. He sat down in the corner of the medical bay and watched her breathe while the dragons slowly relaxed but never took their eyes off him. Hours passed, and Jake thought about all the reasons he should space her and let the universe deal with one less royal elf who probably believed humans were nothing more than animals that needed to be exterminated. But he also thought about Amy, who always believed in doing the right thing, even when it was hard, and who would be disappointed if Jake became the monster the elves claimed all humans were. The medical computer beeped and announced that Lyra was regaining consciousness, and Jake stood up and made sure she could see he was not holding any weapons. Her violet eyes opened slowly, and confusion filled them as she looked around the unfamiliar medical bay before her gaze locked onto Jake. Lyra tried to sit up quickly but gasped in pain from her cracked ribs, and the dragons immediately flew to her, making concerned chirping sounds. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice weak but still carrying the authority of someone born into power. You are on my ship, the Wanderer. Jake replied, keeping his distance because he did not want to provoke the dragons again. Lyra's eyes widened when she realized she was on a human vessel, and her hand instinctively reached for weapons that were no longer there. The red dragon, which Lyra called Ember, took a defensive position, while the blue dragon named Frost watched Jake with what looked like curiosity. "Why did you save me?" Lyra asked, and genuine confusion filled her voice because she had been taught that humans were savage creatures who killed for pleasure. Jake considered lying but decided the truth was simpler, and said because leaving someone to die in space is not who I am, even if that someone is the daughter of the man who murdered my family. Lyra's face went pale, and she looked down at her hands as shame washed over her features. "I did not know," she whispered, and tears formed in her eyes, which surprised Jake because he did not think elven royalty cared about human suffering. "Your ship was destroyed by raiders," Jake explained, "and your escape pod was damaged and drifting toward the nebula's radiation core, so I pulled you out." "How long have I been unconscious?" Lyra asked while gently stroking Ember's scales to calm the agitated dragon. "About 6 hours," Jake replied, "and I patched up your injuries, but you need rest and your communication systems were completely fried, so nobody knows where you are." Lyra processed this information and realized she was completely at the mercy of a human who had every reason to hate her. "What are you going to do with me?" she asked, trying to keep fear from her voice. Jake sighed and ran a hand through his dark hair before answering. "Honestly, I do not know yet, because keeping you is dangerous, but so is letting you go." Frost suddenly flew over to Jake and landed on his shoulder, which made both the captain and princess stare in shock. "Your dragon seems to like me," Jake said with a small smile as Frost nuzzled against his neck. "Frost has always been able to sense good souls," Lyra replied quietly, "and she never approaches people who mean harm." "Maybe I am just good at fooling dragons," Jake suggested, but there was no real conviction in his words. "Or maybe," Lyra said softly, "you are a better man than you think you are." The medical computer announced that Lyra needed nutrition, and Jake went to prepare food, while Frost remained perched on his shoulder, and Ember stayed protectively with the princess. As Jake heated up ration packs, he wondered what he had gotten himself into, because harboring an elven princess was basically a death sentence. But when he returned to the medical bay and saw Lyra's grateful smile as he handed her food, something shifted in his chest. They ate in silence while the dragons flew between them as if trying to bridge the gap between two people who were supposed to be enemies. Jake noticed that Lyra winced every time she moved, and he adjusted her pain medication without being asked. "Thank you," Lyra said, and she meant it for more than just the medical care. Jake nodded and replied, "We have 3 days until we reach Nova Station, and then you can contact your people. What will you do until then?" Lyra asked, wondering if she would spend those days locked in the medical bay. "I guess we will figure that out together," Jake said. And for the first time in 5 years, he felt something other than anger when looking at an elf Ember, and Frost chirped happily as if they approved of this tentative truce between their mistress and the human captain who had saved her life. The next morning, Lyra woke to find Jake sleeping in the chair beside her medical bed, with his plasma pistol still holstered, and Frost curled up in his lap like a contented cat. Ember was perched on the edge of the bed, watching over both the princess and the human captain as if protecting them equally. Lyra studied Jake's face and noticed the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights, and the scar across his jaw that looked like it came from an elven energy blade. She wondered what kind of man saves his enemy and then stays by her side to make sure she does not die in her sleep. Jake's eyes opened suddenly, and he reached for his weapon before remembering where he was and who was watching him. "Sorry," Lyra said softly. "I did not mean to startle you." Jake relaxed and gently moved Frost from his lap, which made the blue dragon chirp in protest before flying over to join Ember. "How are you feeling?" Jake asked while checking the medical readouts that showed Lyra's ribs were healing faster than human bones would. "Better," she replied, and then added, "Because of you." Jake shrugged uncomfortably because he was not used to elves thanking him for anything. "I made breakfast, if you can call reconstituted protein bars and synthetic coffee breakfast," Jake said, trying to change the subject. Lyra smiled and said, "It sounds better than what I usually eat on military ships," which is just nutritional paste that tastes like metal. They moved to the small galley where Jake had set up. 2 places at the narrow table, and the dragons immediately claimed the empty seats as if joining them for a family meal. Jake handed Lyra a protein bar, and she bit into it carefully because her ribs still hurt when she moved too quickly. "This is actually good," she said with surprise, because elven food was usually bland and focused only on nutrition, rather than taste. Jake laughed and replied, "Well, do not get too excited, because I only have 12 more of these, and then we are down to the really bad rations." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Lyra asked the question that had been bothering her since she woke up. "Why do you really hate my people?" Jake's expression darkened, and he set down his coffee cup before answering. "Because 5 years ago your father's fleet attacked my home colony without warning or mercy." Lyra listened quietly as Jake continued, and his voice was thick with old grief. "They said we were expanding too close to elven territory, but that was a lie because we had been there for 20 years and never caused any problems." "What happened?" Lyra asked, even though she was afraid of the answer. Jake took a deep breath and said they bombed the civilian sectors first and killed thousands of people who were just trying to live their lives, and my sister Amy was in school when the building collapsed. "I am so sorry," Lyra whispered, and tears ran down her face because she knew her father was capable of such cruelty. "I tried to save her," Jake continued, and his hands trembled as he spoke, "but I was too late, and all I could do was hold her while she died, and she was only 12 years old." Lyra reached across the table and took Jake's hand without thinking, and he did not pull away. "My father told me that humans attacked first," she said quietly, "and that we were defending ourselves. But I see now that he lied about everything." Jake looked at their joined hands and felt something break inside the wall he had built around his heart. "Your people are not all like your father," he admitted, "because if you were, then you would have tried to kill me the moment you woke up." Lyra squeezed his hand gently and replied, "And your people are not all like the monsters my father described, because a monster would not have saved me." Ember flew over and landed on their joined hands while Frost perched on Jake's shoulder, and both dragons seemed pleased with this development. "Tell me about Amy," Jake said suddenly, "because I want you to know who she was." Lyra nodded and listened as Jake described his little sister who loved to paint and wanted to be an artist and who always saw the best in people, even when they did not deserve it. "She sounds like she was wonderful," Lyra said, "and I wish I could have met her." Jake smiled sadly and replied, "She would have liked you, because Amy always believed that people from different worlds could be friends if they just tried to understand each other over the next few hours." Jake showed Lyra around his ship, which was small but well-maintained and filled with little touches that made it feel like a home, rather than just a vessel. Lyra noticed pictures on the walls of Jake with other humans who were smiling and laughing, and she realized that her people had taken away his entire world in return. Lyra told Jake about growing up in the Imperial Palace where she was trained to be a perfect princess who never questioned her father's decisions. "I always felt like something was wrong," she admitted, "but everyone around me said that humans were the enemy and that we were protecting the galaxy from their aggression." Jake listened without judgment as Lyra described the propaganda and lies that elven children were taught from birth. "When did you start doubting?" Jake asked while adjusting the ship's navigation systems. Lyra thought for a moment before answering. 2 years ago, I was part of a diplomatic mission to a neutral planet, and I saw human refugees who had lost everything because of our attacks." "What? Did you see that changed your mind?" Jake asked. Lyra's voice broke as she replied, "I saw children who looked just like the elven children I grew up with, except they were starving and homeless and their eyes were filled with fear and pain." "And what did you do about it?" Jake asked quietly. "Nothing," Lyra admitted with shame, "because I was a coward who returned to my comfortable palace and tried to forget what I had seen. But you did not forget." Jake observed. "No," Lyra agreed, "I did not forget, and I started asking questions that made my father angry. And my advisor's nervous." "Is that why you were on that ship?" Jake asked. "Because you were running away?" Lyra shook her head and explained, "I was investigating reports of illegal weapons testing that my father denied existed, but I found proof that he was developing biological weapons designed specifically to kill humans." Jake's blood ran cold. Because biological weapons were banned by every civilized species in the galaxy. I was bringing that evidence to the Galactic Council. Lyra continued, but someone sabotaged my ship and I barely escaped before it exploded. So someone in your father's government tried to kill you, Jake said. And it was not a question. Yes, Lyra replied. And now I have no evidence and no way to prove what he is doing. Jake thought for a moment before saying, I have contacts in the human resistance who have been gathering intelligence on your father's operations for years. Lyra looked at him with hope and asked, Do you think they would help me? Jake nodded slowly and replied, If you are serious about stopping your father and ending this war, then yes, I think they would help you. But Jake continued, and his voice was serious. You need to understand that my people will not trust you easily because an elven princess asking for help sounds like a trap, I understand. Lyra said firmly, and I am willing to do whatever it takes to prove that I am sincere. Ember and Frost flew around the galley doing loop-de-loops as if celebrating this new alliance. Jake stood up and extended his hand to Lyra, who took it, and they shook on their agreement. We dock at Nova Station in 2 days, Jake said, and I will arrange a meeting with the resistance leaders, but I cannot promise they will listen. Lyra smiled and replied, 2 days ago I was floating dead in space, and now I have a chance to stop my father, and maybe save both our peoples, so I will take whatever help I can get. Jake found himself smiling back and realized that Princess Lyra was nothing like he expected an elven royal to be. They spent the rest of the day planning their strategy while the dragons played, and for the first time since Amy died, Jake felt like he had a purpose beyond just survival and revenge. As night fell on the ship, Jake showed Lyra to the small guest quarters and said, Get some rest because tomorrow we start preparing for what might be the most important meeting of your life. Lyra touched his arm gently and replied, Thank you, Jake, for giving me a chance when you had every reason not to. Jake nodded and left before he could say something he might regret, because he was starting to care about the elven princess, and that was dangerous for both of them. The alarm that woke Jake was not the gentle morning chime, but the harsh screech of incoming ships detected by his long-range scanners. He ran to the cockpit, still half-dressed, and pulled up the tactical display, which showed 3 elven warships. Closing fast on his position, Lyra appeared behind him wrapped in a blanket with Ember and Frost flying nervously around her head. Those are Royal Guard vessels, she said, and her voice was tight with fear, because they only answer to my father, Jake's. Mind raced through options, and none of them were good because his small cargo ship could not outrun military warships. They are hailing us, Jake said, and looked at Lyra for guidance because she knew her people better than he did. Put them through, Lyra commanded, and her entire demeanor changed from the scared woman to the imperial princess who was born to command. The view screen flickered and showed a stern, elven commander in full military armor with the imperial crest emblazoned across his chest. Princess Lyra, the commander said with barely concealed contempt, We have orders to retrieve you from your human captor. Jake started to protest, but Lyra held up her hand to silence him. Commander Vex, she said coldly. I was not captured, and Captain Harrison saved my life after someone sabotaged my ship. The commander's expression did not change as he replied, Your father, the Emperor, demands your immediate return, and the human must be arrested for kidnapping a member of the royal family. Lyra's eyes flashed with anger, and she drew herself up to her full height. Despite the pain in her ribs, I am Princess Lyra, daughter of Emperor Theron and heir to the Silver Throne, she announced, and her voice carried absolute authority. And I order you to stand down immediately. Commander Vex looked uncertain because disobeying a direct order from the princess was treason, but so was ignoring the Emperor's command. Captain Harrison is under my personal protection, Lyra continued, and any action taken against him or his vessel will be considered an act of aggression against me personally. Jake stared at Lyra in shock because she was risking everything to protect him. The commander's face twisted with frustration before he replied, I must report this to the Emperor and he will not be pleased, tell my father. Lyra said with ice in her voice that I will return to the capital when I am ready, and not a moment before, and remind him that I still have the authority to command the Royal Guard. Transmission ended and Jake let out a breath. He did not know he was holding. That was incredible, he said. But you just made yourself a target. Lyra smiled grimly and replied, I became a target the moment I discovered my father's plans. And now, at least, I have someone watching my back. The warships maintained their distance but did not leave, and Jake knew they were waiting for new orders from the Emperor. We need to reach Nova Station before they decide to ignore your commands, Jake said while plotting. A new course. Lyra nodded and asked, is there any way to go faster? Jake grinned and replied, hold on to something because I am about to push this ship past its safety limits. He fired up the auxiliary engines and the Wanderer shot forward at a speed that made the hull groan in protest. Ember and Frost chirped excitedly because dragons loved speed and they flew around the cockpit doing barrel rolls. The elven warships followed, but they were built for firepower, not speed, and the Wanderer slowly pulled ahead. Jake's hands flew over the controls as he navigated through an asteroid field that would have been suicide at normal speeds. Lyra watched him work and realized that Jake was not just a good pilot but an exceptional one who knew his ship like it was an extension of his own body. A proximity alarm blared as one of the warships fired a warning shot across their bow. They are trying to disable our engines, Lyra said while studying the tactical display. Jake banked hard to the left and dove under a massive asteroid while the pursuing warship struggled to match his maneuvers. Tell me something, Princess, Jake said while dodging another volley of shots. Do you know how to fire a plasma cannon? Lyra raised an eyebrow and replied, I was trained in all forms of combat from the age of 5. Jake laughed and said, then get to the weapon station because I could use some help keeping them off our tail. Lyra slid into the weapons chair, and her fingers moved confidently over the controls. I am not going to kill my own people, she warned, but I can certainly make them regret chasing us. Jake nodded in approval as Lyra targeted the lead warship's shield generators with precision strikes that forced them to drop back for repairs. Wanderer shot out of the asteroid field and into open space where Nova Station appeared on the horizon, like a massive wheel spinning slowly against the stars. We are almost there, Jake announced, but those warships are not giving up. Lyra fired another burst that disabled the second warship's navigation array and bought them precious minutes. Nova Station control. This is Captain Jake Harrison requesting emergency docking privileges. He transmitted on all frequencies. This is Nova Station control, came the reply. You are clear for emergency docking bay 7. But be advised there are elven warships in pursuit. Jake pushed the engines to their absolute limit and the Wanderer screamed toward the station with the remaining warship right behind them. Lyra targeted the warship's communication array and fired a direct hit that cut off their ability to coordinate with their command. The station's defensive batteries activated and created a barrier between the Wanderer and its pursuers. Jake guided his ship through the narrow docking bay entrance and the massive doors slammed shut behind them, just as the elven warship fired one last desperate shot that splashed harmlessly against the station's shields. They made it, and both Jake and Lyra collapsed back in their chairs with relief. That was too close, Jake said, and his heart was still racing from the adrenaline. Lyra smiled at him and replied, You are an amazing pilot, and I have never seen anyone navigate like that. Jake felt his face flush at the compliment, but before he could respond, station security was already surrounding his ship captain. Harrison, please exit your vessel, with your hands visible, came the announcement over the intercom. Jake and Lyra looked at each other, and he asked, Are you ready for this? Lyra stood up and straightened her clothes, which were still the borrowed human garments Jake had given her. I am ready, she replied, and then added, As long as you are beside me. They walked down the boarding ramp, together with Ember and Frost flying protectively overhead. Station security consisted of officers from a dozen different species, all armed and looking nervous. I am Princess Lyra of the Elven Empire, Lyra announced, and this human saved my life and I demand that he be treated with the respect due to a hero. The security chief stepped forward, and Jake recognized her as Commander Nina Cross, a veteran human officer who had fought in the war. Captain Harrison, the commander said with surprise, Thought you were dead. Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated, Jake replied with a tired smile. Commander Cross looked at Lyra with suspicion and asked, Why should we believe that an elven princess is here voluntarily? Because, Lyra said firmly, I have information about a conspiracy that threatens every species in this galaxy, and I need to speak with the human resistance leadership immediately. The commander considered this for a long moment before saying, I will arrange a meeting, but you, Both will be under guard until we verify your story? That is acceptable, Jake said, because we have nothing to hide. They were escorted to a secure conference room where they waited while Commander Cross contacted the resistance leaders. Lyra sat down, heavily, and winced as her ribs reminded her that she was still injured. Jake handed her a pain medication tablet and said, "You should rest before the meeting." Lyra swallowed the tablet and replied, "I can rest when this is over, and my father is stopped." Ember landed on the table and nudged Jake's hand while Frost curled up in Lyra's lap. "These dragons really like you," Jake observed. "They sense that you are trustworthy," Lyra explained. "And dragons are never wrong about people." Jake wondered if that was true, because he had done things during the war that haunted his dreams. "Whatever you are thinking, stop it," Lyra said, as if reading his mind, "because I can see the guilt on your face." "How do you know I feel guilty?" Jake asked. Because Lyra replied gently, "Feel it too, and we both carry the weight of things we cannot change, but we can choose what we do next." The door opened, and Commander Cross returned with 3 serious-looking humans who wore the insignia of the Resistance High Command Captain Harrison, one of them said, and Jake recognized General Lisa Grant, who had been his commanding officer before the colony was destroyed. "And we need to hear everything." General Lisa Grant stood at the head of the conference table studying Princess Lyra, with the calculating gaze of someone who had survived too many betrayals to trust easily. Jake sat beside Lyra with Ember perched on his shoulder and Frost on hers, and both dragons were unusually quiet, as if sensing the tension in the room before we begin. General Grant said, "I need to know why Captain Harrison would risk everything to bring an elven princess to this station." Lyra met the general's gaze without flinching and replied, "Because I have proof that my father is developing biological weapons designed to exterminate humans, and I was bringing that evidence to the Galactic Council when someone tried to kill me." The room erupted in angry voices as the resistance leaders demanded answers and questioned whether this was an elaborate trap. Jake slammed his hand on the table and shouted enough, and the room fell silent, because everyone knew Jake had lost more than most in this war. "I know what you are all thinking," he said, and his voice was steady but firm, because I thought the same thing when I found her. "But Princess Lyra has had multiple opportunities to betray me, and instead, she protected me from her own father's warships general." Grant raised her hand for silence and asked Lyra, "What proof do you have of these weapons?" Lyra's expression darkened as she explained, "I infiltrated my father's research facility on the moon of Draxus and copied files showing tests on human prisoners who were infected with engineered viruses that targeted their DNA." The room went cold because everyone understood what this meant. "Where are these files now?" Another resistance leader named Colonel Ray Duncan demanded. Lyra looked down at her hands and admitted they were on my ship's computer core, which was destroyed when the vessel exploded. "So you have no proof," Colonel Duncan said, with barely concealed contempt, "and you expect us to believe you on faith alone." Jake stood up and his voice was hard as steel when he said, "I believe her, and that should count for something." General Grant studied Jake for a long moment before saying, "Your word does count, Captain, but we need more than belief to start a war crimes investigation. I can get you into the facility," Lyra offered, and her voice was desperate because she knew this might be her only chance to stop her father. "Absolutely not," General Grant said firmly, "because sending humans into elven territory is suicide." "Then send me," Lyra replied, "and I will retrieve the evidence myself." Jake immediately protested, saying, "You barely escaped with your life last time, and now your father knows you are a threat." Lyra turned to face Jake, and her violet eyes were filled with determination as she said, "I have to do this, because if I do not, then millions of humans will die, and I cannot live with that on my conscience." Ember chirped softly and flew from Jake's shoulder to land on the table between them, as if trying to bridge the growing distance. "Let me go with her," Jake said to the general, "and I can keep her safe while she gets the evidence." General Grant laughed bitterly and replied, "You want me to authorize a mission that sends my best pilot into enemy territory with an elven princess who might be leading you into a trap?" "Yes," Jake said, simply because it is the right thing to do. The general looked at the other resistance leaders who were arguing amongst themselves about the risks and benefits. Finally, General Grant raised her hand for silence and said, "I will authorize this mission on one condition. Name it, Jake replied. The general's eyes were hard as she said, if this is a trap, you kill the princess and get out alive because we cannot afford to lose you. Captain Lyra's face went pale, but she nodded in acceptance because she understood that trust had to be earned. Jake felt sick at the thought, but he also knew the general was right to be cautious. So he agreed. We leave in 6 hours, General Grant announced, and you will take a stealth ship with a small team of specialists who will monitor from orbit. Lyra stood and said, I need to send a message to someone I trust in the royal court to arrange our infiltration. The general nodded and replied, you can use our secure communication system, but we will be monitoring everything you send. That is acceptable, Lyra said, and followed Commander Cross out of the room. When they were alone, General Grant looked at Jake and asked, do you really believe she can be trusted? Jake thought about the past few days aboard the Wanderer and how Lyra had opened up to him about her doubts and her discoveries. Yes, he finally answered. I believe she is sincere about stopping her father. The general sighed and said, I hope you are right, Jake, because if you are wrong, then we are sending you to your death. I have been living on borrowed time since the colony fell. Jake replied, so dying now is not my biggest fear. What is your biggest fear? Then, the general asked. Jake looked toward the door where Lyra had exited and admitted failing her and letting another person I care about die, because I was not good enough to save them. General Grant's expression softened, because she remembered the young man Jake had been before the war broke him. Just come back alive, she said quietly. Because we have lost too many good people already. Jake spent the next few hours preparing for the mission, while Lyra coordinated with her contact in the royal court. They met again in the hangar where a sleek stealth ship called the Shadow Runner was being loaded with equipment. The mission team consisted of Jake as pilot, Lyra as their guide, and 3 resistance operatives who specialized in infiltration and data extraction. The team leader was a woman named Kelly Shaw, who had cold blue eyes and scars from elven torture during her time as a prisoner of Warshaw, made it clear she did not trust Lyra and would not hesitate to eliminate her if the mission went wrong. I understand, Lyra said calmly, and I would expect nothing less. Jake checked the Shadowrunner's systems while Ember and Frost explored the new ship with obvious excitement. The dragons seemed to sense they were going on an adventure, and they flew loops around the cargo bay. Kelly Shaw watched the dragons with suspicion and asked, are those things going to be a problem? Ember responded by breathing a small puff of smoke in Shaw's direction, which made the operative reach for her weapon. They stay with me, Lyra said firmly, because Ember and Frost are part of who I am, and I will not leave them behind. Jake intervened before the situation could escalate and said, the dragons have saved my life more than once, so they are coming with us. Shaw glared at Jake but nodded in acceptance, because everyone on the mission knew that Jake was in command. The other 2 operatives were brothers named Tom and Chris Martinez, who were experts in bypassing security systems. They introduced themselves to Lyra with professional courtesy, but their eyes remained guarded. Lyra understood that earning their trust would take more than words, so she focused on reviewing the mission plan. The facility on Draxus was heavily guarded with multiple layers of security that included armed patrols, automated defenses, and biometric scanners. Lyra explained that she could bypass the biometric scanners using her royal access codes, but they would need to move quickly before her father's people realized she was there. What about guards? Jake asked while studying. The facility layout. Lyra's expression was grim as she replied, we avoid them if possible, but if we are discovered, I will order them to stand down using my authority as princess. And if they do not listen, Kelly Shaw asked with skepticism, then we fight. Our way out, Lyra said, and her voice carried the steel of someone who had made peace with violence. The Shadowrunner launched from Nova Station under cover of a supply convoy that was heading toward neutral space. Once they cleared the station's sensor range, Jake activated the stealth systems and the ship became invisible to most scanning technology. The journey to Draxus took 18 hours, and during that time the team went over the mission plan repeatedly. Lyra and Jake found themselves working together with an easy efficiency that surprised both of them. When they were alone in the cockpit, during a quiet moment, Lyra asked Jake if he really would kill her if the mission turned out to be a trap. Jake was silent for a long time before Answering honestly, I do not know if I could. That is not very reassuring, Lyra said, but there was a small smile on her face. I know, Jake replied, but it is the truth, and I would rather be honest with you than lie. Lyra reached over and took his hand, saying, I am glad you saved me, Jake Harrison, because you are the first person in a long time who treats me like I am more than just a title. You are more than a title, Jake agreed, and you are brave and smart, and you care about doing what is right, even when it costs you everything. They sat in comfortable silence watching the stars stream past until Kelly Shaw's voice came over the intercom, announcing that they were approaching Draxus Jake, and Lyra returned to the cargo bay where the team was doing final equipment checks. Ember and Frost sensed the tension and stayed close to their mistress, offering silent comfort. Remember the plan, Jake said to everyone, and we get in, retrieve the data, and get out without engaging unless absolutely necessary. Kelly Shaw checked her weapons and muttered, This is either going to be the greatest intelligence coup of the war or the stupidest way any of us have ever died. Lyra smiled grimly and replied, Let us make sure it is the former. The Shadow Runner descended through Draxus's atmosphere, and Jake piloted them toward the research facility using the approach vector that Lyra's contact had provided. The research facility loomed ahead like a dark fortress built into the side of a mountain, with towers that reached toward Draxus's purple sky. Jake landed the Shadow Runner in a hidden valley 3 kilometers from the facility, and the team moved. Out under cover of darkness, Lyra led them through rocky terrain that she had memorized during her first infiltration, and Ember and Frost flew silently overhead, acting as scouts. Kelly Shaw and the Martinez brothers moved with practiced efficiency, their weapons ready and their eyes constantly scanning for threats. They reached the facility's outer perimeter, where Lyra used her royal access codes to disable a section of the sensor grid. So far, so good, Tom Martinez whispered as they slipped through the gap. The first guard patrol appeared around a corner, and everyone froze as Lyra stepped forward with absolute authority. Stand aside, she commanded, and her voice carried the imperial tone that no elven soldier could ignore. The guards recognized Princess Lyra and immediately snapped to attention, but their confusion was evident. Your Highness, one guard stammered. We were not informed of your arrival. This is a surprise inspection, Lyra said coldly, and these are my personal security team, and anyone who questions my authority will answer directly to the Emperor. The guards quickly moved aside because questioning the princess was a career-ending mistake at best. Jake was impressed by how easily Lyra manipulated her own people using their training and culture against them. They entered the facility through a side entrance that led to the research laboratories deep underground. The corridors were sterile and white with the harsh lighting that made everything look cold and lifeless. Lyra navigated them through the maze with confidence until they reached a secure door marked with biohazard symbols. This is it, she said, and placed her hand on the scanner, which beeped and turned green. The door slid open, revealing a laboratory filled with computer terminals and containment units that held samples of the biological weapons. Chris Martinez immediately went to work downloading files, while Tom set up a portable scanner to copy the physical evidence. Kelly Shaw positioned herself at the door, watching for any signs of discovery. Jake and Lyra moved deeper into the lab, where they found something that made Jake's blood run cold. Behind reinforced glass were holding cells containing human prisoners who looked sick and dying. Lyra gasped and covered her mouth because seeing the victims in person was different from reading about them in reports. We have to free them, Jake said, and moved toward the cell controls. Wait, Kelly Shaw hissed. There is no way we can evacuate prisoners without alerting the entire facility. Jake turned to face her, and his voice was deadly serious when he said, I am not leaving them here to die. Lyra made the decision by walking to the control panel and entering her override codes, which opened all the cells simultaneously. Alarms immediately began blaring throughout the facility, and red emergency lights bathed everything in crimson. So much for stealth, Chris Martinez said while grabbing the data drives. The prisoners stumbled out of their cells, weak but determined to escape, and Jake quickly organized them into a group. Follow us, he commanded, and we will get you out of here. Armed guards poured into the corridor outside the lab, and Kelly Shaw opened fire to cover their escape. Tom and Chris joined her, and their weapons created a deadly crossfire that forced the guards back. Lyra grabbed Jake's arm and said there is another exit through the ventilation system, but we have to move now. Jake helped the prisoners while Ember and Frost flew ahead to scout the route. They crawled through narrow ventilation shafts that were barely large enough for humans and emerged in a loading bay where supply transports were parked. Guards were already surrounding the area, but they hesitated when they saw Princess Lyra leading the humans. "I order you to stand down," Lyra shouted. But her authority was crumbling because the guards had received orders directly from the Emperor. Commander Vex appeared with a squad of elite royal guards, and his expression was triumphant. "Princess Lyra," he announced, "you are under arrest for treason against the Empire, and the humans with you will be executed immediately." Lyra stepped in front of Jake and the prisoners, her dragons flanking her with scales glowing bright with power. "If you want them, you will have to go through me," she said, and her voice was filled with royal fury. Vex laughed and replied, "Your father predicted you would betray us, and he has ordered me to bring you back dead or alive." Ember and Frost suddenly grew larger as they channeled their ancient dragon magic, and their roar shook the entire facility. The guards fell back in fear because dragons were sacred creatures and harming them was a taboo that transcended even imperial orders. Jake used the distraction to get the prisoners onto one of the transport ships while Kelly and the Martinez brothers held off the guards. "Lyra, do we have the data?" Jake shouted over the chaos. Chris Martinez held up the data drives and yelled, "Everything is here." "Then we go now," Jake commanded, and everyone piled into the transport ship. Lyra was the last to board, and as she did, Commander Vex raised his weapon to shoot her in the back. Jake saw what was happening and pushed Lyra aside, taking the energy blast in his shoulder that sent him sprawling. Lyra screamed and dropped to his side while Ember and Frost attacked Vex with fire, and Ice Kelly Shaw dragged both Jake and Lyra into the ship and slammed her fist on the door control. The transport launched with guards firing at them, and Lyra took the pilot seat because Jake was injured and losing blood. She flew the transport like she had been born to it, weaving through the facility's defenses and climbing toward space. The Shadowrunner appeared above them, and Tom Martinez's voice came through the comm saying, "We have your back, Princess." 3 elven fighters pursued them, but the Shadowrunner's weapons took them out with precise shots. Jake groaned in pain, and Lyra glanced back at him with tears in her eyes. "Stay with me," she pleaded, "because I cannot lose you now." Jake smiled weakly and replied, "I am not going anywhere, because someone has to make sure you do not start another war." They reached the Shadowrunner and transferred everyone aboard before abandoning the stolen transport. Kelly Shaw immediately began treating Jake's wound, while the rescued prisoners collapsed in relief. Lyra sat beside Jake, holding his hand as the medical nanobots worked to repair the damage from the energy blast. "You saved my life," she whispered, "and almost got yourself killed." "That is what friends do," Jake replied, and his voice was getting stronger as the nanobots did their work. "Friends," Lyra repeated with a smile that was both sad and happy. Jake squeezed her hand and said, "Yes. Friends who risk everything for each other." The Shadowrunner jumped to faster than light speed and left Draxus behind. General Grant's voice came through the communication system demanding a status report. "Mission accomplished," Kelly Shaw reported. "And we have the evidence plus 20 rescued prisoners and 1 very stubborn captain who took a hit." "Is he alive?" the general asked. "I am alive," Jake called out, "and we got everything we need to expose the Emperor." The general sighed with relief and replied, "Come home, Captain, and bring your friend the Princess, because the galaxy needs to hear what you found." The journey back to Nova Station took 2 days, during which Jake recovered and the team analyzed the evidence they had stolen. The files showed everything, including videos of human prisoners being infected with the bioweapon and detailed plans for deploying it across human colonies. Lyra watched the videos with horror and shame because this was her father's legacy of cruelty and genocide. When they docked at Nova Station, a massive crowd had gathered because word had spread about their mission. The rescued prisoners were immediately taken to medical facilities, and Jake insisted on walking off the ship under his own power. Lyra walked beside him with Ember and Frost flying overhead, and the crowd fell silent as they passed. General Grant met them at the entrance to the command center, and her expression was grim. "The Galactic Council has agreed to an emergency session," she announced, "and they want to hear testimony from both of you." Jake and Lyra looked at each other and nodded. because this was the moment they had been fighting for. The council chamber was filled with representatives from every major species in the galaxy, and the tension was thick enough to cut. Lyra stepped forward and began presenting the evidence, her voice steady, despite the enormity of what she was revealing. She showed the videos, the documents, and the testimony of the rescued prisoners, and the council watched in horrified silence. When she finished, Lyra looked directly at the Elven ambassador and said, "My father must be held accountable for these crimes, and I will testify against him." The ambassador tried to protest, but the evidence was overwhelming and other council members shouted him down. Jake added his testimony about the attack on his colony and how the war had been built on lies from the beginning. The council voted unanimously to launch a war crimes investigation and to demand Emperor Theron's immediate arrest. Lyra knew this meant she could never return home, but she felt lighter than she had in years as they left the council chamber. Jake asked, "What will you do?" Now Lyra smiled and replied, "I will help rebuild what my father destroyed, and maybe along the way I will find a new home." "You already have one," Jake said, and gestured to the humans who were cheering for the elven princess who had risked everything for justice. Ember and Frost flew joyfully through the air as if celebrating the dawn of a new era. The war was not over, but for the first time there was real hope for peace between humans and elves.